Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. It is nice to be with you. We are, as we have been doing or trying to do, we are live streaming today. So we'd like to welcome those of you who are tuned in live to the program. So we got Matty Two Shoes and SQL Nikon, who I was going to give a shout out to in a moment, but he beat me to the punch, right? He's live with us here. So this is episode 215, and we are super excited to have Andy Leonard with us today. Andy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Eugene. It's an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm a little spoiled in the sense that I get Andy in my backyard, right? So Andy was one of the folks who put together the user group in Richmond before he moved a little further from Richmond, and so we've been living in his shadow for a long time, and reaping all of the seeds that he sowed. And so thanks, Andy, for being with us again. For those of you who don't know Andy all that well, right? He's the founder and the chief data engineer at Enterprise Data and Analytics, and is also Microsoft MVP. Also a BIML hero, right? It seems like back when we were getting together anyway, it didn't seem like there were too many events. You couldn't throw a stick and not hit Andy Leonard's name or book or session or
well, way over recognized
in some fashion. So
I appreciate that. But yeah, it's always been an honor to be part of this community. It's a phenomenal community. And gosh, it's been 15 years almost since Frank and I were talking about the SQL Server Users Group in Richmond. Mm. And somebody had one before. I can't remember who it was. And I know Frank reached out to him and said, hey, we'd love to help. We want to get this going again. And sure. The person who had done it before, as will happen, just wasn't interested in re-engaging with it. I don't know if they didn't have success, or I think I remember Frank saying something along the lines of they didn't think it was going to work. And no judgment, I promise.
Sure.
It's hard.
It's very hard. Yeah,
it's a lot of work, and I doubt I could have done it alone. Frank probably could have, because he's a dynamo. But together we were able to get it restarted, and a lot of people jumped right in from the beginning. Carlos, you and Ron Deskins and AZ and Jamie, and they're still Wayne
and Jamie still running with it. Yep.
Yeah. So it wasn't hard. So I needed to back away for a little while after that, and I actually stepped away from the MVP. I was one from 2007 to 2012. Needed to take care of some priorities. Did that, and started re-engaging around 2018, 2019, was re-awarded MVP, data platform this time. It's changed. Yeah. It used to be SQL Server. And very honored to be part of that program. I never feel like I deserve it. I keep looking at all of the other stuff other people are doing and going, oh, that is so cool. And, that person deserves way more recognition than me. So
sure.
Like I said, I feel like I'm over-recognized a lot. I do love what I do, and that's kind of the reward for it. We've been having a lot of interesting conversations around the house about passion, driving career choices. And I've been one of those people who said for years, so I start with, I'm very passionate about what I do, and that's a blessing. I know that. And I thought, that was great advice because it worked. I think it worked well for me. Go do what you're passionate about. But the more I've looked into that and the more I've heard other people's perspective on that, I get it when they say find something you can be passionate about and that you are perhaps good at even.
Sure.
And then become passionate about that. It's never been I've never had that delimiter. It's not been my experience. So maybe I've been giving people bad advice. I hope not. But yeah, I'm very, like I said, very blessed to be doing what I love.
So our topic today is going to be Azure Data Factory, right?
Woo!
And so before we get into that, we do have a couple of shout outs I want to give. And as always, compañeros, you'll forgive me, right? You'd think, again, with somebody with the last name of Chacon, that I could get some of this right. I won't tell you how long it took me to get Eugene's last name rolling off the tongue. So we've got Kaiser Sozi, Sarush Kardani, Yashir Fazal, Vengish Vicky, Rohit Kumar, Nick Hashbarger. Is it Hashbarger? He's at Century One. That's Nick from Century One. Anyway, so thanks, Nick. Kate Cooper, Kara Zeigel, and then of course we talked about Doug, who says hello, Andy, down
Doug.
in my old stomping grounds. So he says he has something to send to me, and I don't know if so the story I told it last week, but the story with Doug is that so he actually works at Elon University, which is where I grew up. I grew up like 3 miles away from the college, and the elementary school it was on Elon campus. It was right butted up there, and he told me that they were going to tear it down, and I told him I was going to go down there and protest. But he said, I'll send you a brick. So I'm not sure if that's what he has for me. But anyway, he said he saved me a brick from my elementary school.
Very cool.
And so, yeah, we unfortunately don't get to, and that is in fact what he has. So very nice. Well, thanks for holding on to that for me, Doug. I know it's been a hot minute. Okay, so we would announce the 8KB session, but if you were going to do that, then you wouldn't be here because it's going on right now. So we will announce then SQL Trail, which is going to happen on March 18th. And Andy, I think you're going to join us this year.
I hope so.
Okay.
Yeah, you and I have some emails going on
Yep.
that, and I got to find something that fits. I love the focus. I just don't want to crash in and do something off topic. So I love that you're focusing on ERP. Is that correct?
So we are. So this SQL Trail is going to focus on ERP. I think we will still be using a lot of the technologies that we've been talking about, even Azure Data Factory, right? But we'd like to tie it or the examples, make some use cases if we can around the ERPs and some situational scenarios where you're receiving product. You're doing something to it and then shipping it out, right? So those are, some fairly common, scenarios that those ERP folks have to deal with.
Okay,
right?
I'll commit to doing that. I've got some demos that are close, but I can certainly change the, source and target tables and make them around ERP, and I'll submit something here in the next few days, Carlos.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. The URL for today's show notes, if you want to check those out, will be at SQLDataPartners.com/ADF or SQLDataPartners.com/215 for the session. Okay, so first I want to jump into some situational uses for Azure Data Factory. So give us some reasons. Why would I consider using, or what's it for? Why is Microsoft offering this service now?
So I think the initial thinking, and I didn't really get engaged in version 1 very much. Saw a few talks on it, but I think the original vision was to have some type of data integration engine that was cloud hosted to support cloud to cloud data engineering. And there was some good stuff in version 1. There was the opportunity to do some things that, as often as the case, you lose a little baby in the bathwater. When you switch, you make a new version of this, and
sure,
it reminded me a lot of the switch. I was there when we went away from data transformation services, or DTS, to SSIS, right. And we lost some kind of neat functionality that you can do in SSIS, but it was harder. Same in ADF version 2. But that's the whole idea, cloud hosted for cloud to cloud data integration. That's my take on it.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I don't want to say we're doing it wrong, but inevitably the use cases that I have experience with are all moving data on premise into the cloud, actually.
Yeah, no, you're not doing it wrong in my opinion and experience.
Sure.
Hybrid has just emerged as the dominant force among people using the cloud at all. There's a surprising amount, I would say the majority of enterprises that I interact with at least are not using the cloud or are using it in an experimental fashion. So there's still a lot on premises. I think there's a number of reasons for that, and I don't pretend to know them all.
Sure.
We had an interesting use case that popped up here. We're recording this in January, the end of January 2021, just a few weeks ago. And I'm going to try to keep this just as neutral sounding as possible. But somebody, a company got deplatformed.
Yes.
And it was because of, I'm not exactly sure what the stated reasons were, but there was, some concern about what the company was doing, maybe what they were supporting, and all of a sudden they don't have a platform anymore.
Right.
And I've actually had customers reach out to me and talk to me through this. And initially I thought, that's, my first response when it came to me with concerns about, what happens if that happens to us? It's like, that's not going to happen to you. And then I thought about it and I was like, well, maybe who would, if you'd asked me this question in December, is that possible? I'd have said, I guess, but will it ever happen? I don't think so. So I was kind of giving them my answer that I would have given, anyone a month ago. So I don't know. And I've had to really think about it, and I'm still thinking about it. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you in at least a couple of cases that there were C-levels thinking, how do we manage this new risk?
Sure.
What if our whatever what if our provider says, no, you can't be on our platform anymore?
Right.
And I was like, that's a new question.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that, but yeah. But a lot of people that are using, customers that I work with that are using the cloud, all of them are hybrid. I know of one company that is purely in Azure. The data architect was hired, and part of the goal, and he started over 5 years ago. In fact, it's a friend of ours, Joel Cochran.
Oh.
Joel built the entire enterprise architecture, he did it 5 years ago, back when you had to carve some of the stuff out of wood.
Right.
It was not where it is in 2021. And so sure. Joel's the only person I know that's 100% in the cloud.
Wow.
But
so
yeah.
The scenario that I came across was, so I have a SaaS that has all the customers in one database. So there are, one database with everybody in it. And they had some larger customers that wanted to do some additional reporting that they didn't offer or didn't provide, right? Do some data mining. Right. So they wanted to then pump the data out into a Azure SQL database, right? It just has the company information in it, and then they do some basic. There's some very small ETL just in terms of, hey, let's collapse some tables, right? Let's make it a little bit easier to you could call it duplicating data, right? But they're
Sure.
Anyway, reducing the overall number of tables just to make it a bit more approachable, right?
Right.
And so as they did this, they started having problems, and we took a peek, and the question was, or the issue was, hey, when I'm running this, right, it's running for a long time. Okay. Well, let's take a look, right? I mean, there could be any number of reasons for that. And so I guess maybe what I'm transitioning perhaps a little bit into, I don't know if pitfalls is the right word,
Yeah.
But as you start moving, you start even cloud to cloud there. Now, and again, this example is going to be on-premise to cloud. But as you are doing some of that, what are some common pitfalls that you're seeing that people are maybe kicking themselves in the foot with?
Well, you reminded me of another of our clients whose driver was surfacing their data to external organizations, and they had us work with lift and shift the existing data, re-architect the SSIS so that it targeted not only local but also storage in Azure SQL DB, and we did that. In fact, Eugene, I believe, has worked with me. Eugene and I have worked together before. I think Eugene and I worked together on this particular client. I won't mention their name, not for profit, great organization. And when they ran into that very same scenario, it was like, why is it taking so long? And we did a few tests. The very first thing we went after is classic in Azure, right? Move the sliders, right?
Yeah, sure, okay.
Crank it up. Let's see what's going on. So we started there and we ran some tests. And I just want to pause there for just a second and let everybody know I'm an engineer. That is a warning. And so years ago, I used to carry around a checklist, and I actually did some performance tuning on, SQL Server 2000 and 7.0 and stuff. And I had this little checklist that worked really well in earlier versions of SQL Server. I started back in 6.5. But as 2005 rolled around and that new database engine popped out, I found initially that my checklist was still serving me well. And I got to one organization as a consultant, and I brought the production server to its knees by making some of the changes that I made on my checklist, that it worked everywhere else. And, it's because the data warehouse there was a little bit different. I have a good friend, Nick Harris. Mm-hmm. Nick says, if you've seen one data warehouse, you've seen one data warehouse. And he's not wrong. Well, we like to present it as, you stand on one leg and face east, and you shape the data this way, and you conform it that way, and bam, a data warehouse pops out. That's never the case. There's always somewhere between 10 and 20% there at the very end that's going to end up consuming about 80 or 90% of your time in conforming and shaping and figuring out how that data is actually loaded.
Sure.
So with this client, that's what we did. We moved the sliders first. We found very little improvement at the scale we were using. Now, obviously, we did not take them up to managed instance. We didn't take them up to, dozens of cores. And maybe if we had done that, we would have gotten closer to the performance that we wanted. But we were doing this balancing act between how much does it cost and how well does it perform.
Right.
And what we actually discovered was a couple of things happening inside their enterprise that had been happening all along. It just wasn't that big of a deal. Nobody thought,
sure,
this load takes more than an hour. They just thought, well, that's the way it is. But when it started going to the cloud, people started looking at it. And it took about the same amount of time, which was interesting. But all of a sudden, it was a problem. So we ran through that. And one of their motivators in exposing this data to others was they wanted to take advantage of some of the Power BI features that at the time were cloud only. Honest, Eugene has forgotten more about Power BI than I will ever know. I'm just going to say that right now.
That's fair.
But, at the time there were, and I don't know if they're still doing this or not, there were features that were basically online only, Azure Power BI only. And maybe that's still the case. I don't know. And that's not what they call it. Eugene will correct me in this. And the reason that I don't know all of this stuff is that I know Eugene. So somebody has a question, I say, I know somebody who can help with that. Here's the bad and unfair part about this. And it's not just me. Okay, Eric Darling wrote a book called Nice Post, Brent.
Yeah.
Because Brent got all the credit for
Sure.
Eric's work. It's the same. I call Eugene and they go, Andy Leonard, help me out. And I'm like, this is part of that over-recognized thing. Yeah. all kind of stuff. And it's like, there's stuff I'm dumb as a stick on. Eugene can back me up on those.
Sure.
So can you, Carlos.
Sure.
It's just, I know what I know. And the rest I'm just learning and I'm trying to, I know people like you two,
Right.
Performance tuning, Power BI. I call somebody else. I'm not an expert on any of that. So
That's funny.
But yeah, so that's
you know,
that's the first thing. And then, then you want to look at things like you actually have to architect for brand new problems when you're doing hybrid. Like we're loading from on premises to the cloud. So crazy things were happening. We had something going on their network. I still don't know what it was. But when I was remoting into them just to do work, the network would boot me like every 20 minutes or something. And so I'd just reconnect and go on about my business and do it. Well, I noticed when I'm loading Azure for them, it's timing out in every 20 minutes or so. And it's like, this is more than an hour. So we had to architect for that. And we did it we're starting the whole process. We had an SSIS framework in there, which allowed us to run, in their case, I want to say it was about 200 or 300 SSIS packages. We were able to run that by calling a single stored procedure and passing a single parameter. That's convenient. But in there, we just, in our commercial frameworks, it'll restart where it failed last. So when it would time out, we just bump that restart up in SQL Agent. It works, right? SQL Agent will keep retrying. Wait a minute, start again. It'll reconnect. And so, it maybe takes an extra 20 or 30 minutes. If you look at the total load time, probably it's that much extra in there in over an hour, but it stopped failing and all of the data started making it. So it's, you got to deal with the network connectivity. Sure. And I'm almost positive this was something on their side of the house, probably some setting that was intended for awesomeness and, save them from being hacked.
Yeah, or, whatever, sure.
Something. But yeah.
So we had our situation was the level of Azure SQL database they were using. And I guess I should say, so compañeros, if you are on the live stream with us and have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, and we'll attempt to get it into the conversation here. So one of the things that we found, and unfortunately, compañeros, I don't have a way, or I'm not quite set up to show you, but we will probably make a good blog post. So Azure Data Factory has some interesting graphs, and it can kind of show you, right, where the trend is. And I can't, well, actually, I say that. I don't know if it was in Azure Data Factory or if it was in Azure SQL Database. But what we ran into was we were actually running up against the IOPS. Like, we were writing so much data that the Azure SQL Database, the level that it was at was like, threshold, right? Wow. Let's pump the brakes here. And then, of course, right, then there's stopping mechanisms. So now you have software involved trying to, throttle you, and which, just, again, it kind of compounds everything. And so, again, almost to your point in terms of the slider, which is hilarious because I guess we don't have that same concept, but I feel like in a VM, 80-20 rule. Right. Most of the time people are like, oh, let's just throw some more cores in it. Right. Like that's, but then you get into Azure and all of a sudden, whoa, the slider, like that's going to cost us money. Well,
it's definitely, we've always had this concept in engineering and technology of the economic term. So we'll even kind of mix and match, right? We'll say things like technical debt. And,
sure.
And I've talked often to clients about technical investments, which are kind of the opposite of technical debt. And there's a lot of math in here, and I'm not an economist, but I do understand a couple of things that are economically related. And one of the things that sounds crazy, I've got a lot of crazy things actually that I say, but one in particular is, the earlier you spend money in a development cycle, it really doesn't matter what you're developing. That money is just going to sound crazy, but that money is cheaper the earlier you spend it. And part of it is the total amount of money that you spend. That's easy part of it.
Sure.
But the other part of it is kind of the jump you get on the remainder of the project. So if you try to build a project, and this happened, I've been in software as a hobbyist since I was 11. Okay, so that's 1975. That's coming up on 46 years here. And seen a lot kind of happen over that time. So if you build software and then after you've built all the functionality you want, you then try to add security, which is unfortunately how a lot of software was built before 2000 or so. And that is going to cost you dearly. And I know in 2000, I remember SQL Slammer hit in the early 2000s, and Microsoft did kind of a reset. I mean, they just stopped and re-architected a lot. I've heard rumors this is why we didn't have a SQL Server 2003. Instead, we had a 2005. I don't know how accurate that is.
Sure. Interesting.
It was built, they re-architected, they just paused and said, let's stop and put security in at the very bottom and then build up from there. And it paid off, right? Microsoft went from worst to first in database security and a lot of software. They were getting eaten alive by security people. And rightfully, they weren't picking on Microsoft. Microsoft wasn't as secure as they are now.
So I feel like you've been spending some time with Karen Lopez. All of a sudden, episode 2012 or 212 is coming back to me. Okay. I feel like that she would say the same thing, right? Get the security in at the beginning.
Yeah, she's right about that. And it's not just that. There's other stuff, but that all kind of came about by the School of Hard Knocks.
Sure.
And we all started using those best practices, but in the cloud, it's still it's a brave new world. And Microsoft has gone to great lengths with Azure. So has AWS with with Amazon Web Services. I haven't worked with Google. I imagine they and IBM and everybody else trying cloud is Oracle. They're all concerned about security. But one of the things Microsoft achieved early on was an ISO certification. It's been years now, and it's in that 27,000 range. And that is not trivial, and it's not easy to get, and it's not easy to maintain. So I don't know how the latest thing affected them, the SolarWinds thing. I don't know, but I can guarantee you that triggered an audit of their 27,000 ISO certifications. If it hasn't, it will, because they want to go back and make sure that all of those loops have been closed.
Right.
So those ISO certs are hard.
Yeah. So speaking of certs, right? Or I shouldn't say certs, but features, right? So feature sets. So you already mentioned, right? There was a version 1, there was a version 2 of Azure Data Factory, and there hasn't been a new version that I'm aware of, right? We're still kind of on that version 2, right?
Well, kind of.
Okay, here we go.
Azure Synapse Analytics. I think that can be considered the next version. Of that, yeah. So kind of they started really close to similar in functionality, but it was very easy to see early on that they were looking to do something a little broader and a little more powerful than Azure Data Factory version 2.
Gotcha. So then maybe take us through maybe we can go back, I don't know, 6 or 8 months. I know things kind of got quiet a little bit at the end of the year, but in terms of new features or functionality that's been made available, right? Can you give us kind of an update on what's happening there?
So, fair question. I can't give you a fair answer. Okay. I haven't played with Azure Synapse Analytics enough.
Back to the Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory, right?
Azure Data Factory. So I'm trying to think what they've done recently. They definitely made some cosmetic changes. We have, and then it's going to sound a little goofy, but we have color in the icons now on the activity.
It's not all gray, right?
Huge, right? Not sure how that impacted performance, but anything you can do to improve recognition right away. And it's a dumb sounding thing, but the truth is that for a number of people, not everyone, because some people are colorblind. I'm actually slightly colorblind. I didn't realize this until I was talking to my family about how they were getting all the colors wrong. But yeah, then I realized, I'm seeing things differently than they do. But color is probably the first. I think there are studies that actually say it is the first thing you recognize when you're visually looking at something. I think Microsoft actually conducted a number of UI studies back in the day, and they discovered that. So, but again, that's not for people who, are color challenged, I guess, from an accessibility standpoint. I'm not saying that as a ding. I'm just saying, if I am, I'm dinging myself. But there's, stuff like that actually can help with understanding. And we can relate to it, all of us on this call, because we all write T-SQL. And I know we all format T-SQL in different ways. I write all of the commands in lowercase so that it drives real T-SQL programmers completely nuts.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you're the odd man out there, right? I think, I think everybody's listening is like, dang that Andy Leonard.
That's right. No.
Yeah. You're not going to pass my review, right? Like
I will not pass your code. I often do camel casing, though. I'll capitalize the S and select, and the rest will be lowercase. It's the way that I learned how to write it.
Sure.
And here's what I say about that. And I'm not criticizing you if you put it all caps. Do whatever. But here's what I think. I think it matters to individuals how it's written, and it helps them think. Where I think this falls down is believing that the way I think is the way you think.
Sure.
That's where I think it falls. And I can guarantee if you're typing in all caps and you're using tabs instead of spaces and all of that stuff, you and I think differently.
Sure.
I'm not saying you're wrong. And I'm definitely not going to say I'm wrong. But, I'll say it's different. And my way helps me. And it's the same with the colors on the icons and stuff like that.
There you go.
They're constantly adding connectors. I think the last time they added some connectors was maybe August or September. It went from 80 plus to 90 plus. I think they added around a dozen.
So now we talk about these connectors. I mean, again, they're kind of a cloud first, idea. So these more integrations with SaaS or other cloud, i.e. Salesforce and
stuff like that. It's amazing to see what they're doing there as well. And the last SSIS related integration that I saw in Azure Data Factory was they enabled, and it happened at the end of June 2019. So we're going back a year and a half, I guess, or more. They enabled the ability to execute DTSX files stored in Azure file shares. So what they've done is they've gone to great pains to remove the friction between how you run SSIS on premise and how you would run it in the cloud. So if you don't want to use the SSIS catalog, you have a couple of other options. The legacy options, running it from the file system or running it from MSDB in managed instance, which has an MSDB. They also, around that time, I think it was maybe a month or two later, they added the concept of a package store. And I may be wrong about the timing. That may have been in early 2020. But they tried to replicate all of the ways you could execute SSIS on premises in the cloud. And I don't know for sure why they're doing that, other than, this is me on the outside, just like everybody else.
Sure.
Even though I'm an MVP. But talking to members of the team about it that develops and maintains what we call Azure SSIS, the sense that I get is they're trying to promote this story where you've got a lot of SSIS running on premises, and they want you to promote some at least into the cloud. And there's some things that you SSIS people out there, close your ears for just a minute. There's some things it doesn't do well. And I've said this for more than a decade now, and it's usually to shock and awe, when I make that statement in public, but it doesn't do everything well. You can clean SSIS's clock on premises if your source and your destination are both on the same server in SQL Server. You can do it in T-SQL. That SQL OS will beat the dickens out of a data flow. It'll run 10 or 100 times faster, especially in 2012 plus.
Sure.
Now, it's not true for every scenario, but for a lot of scenarios, that's the truth. So the same can be said about SSIS running on premises and running in the cloud. Again, you've got sliders, you've got nodes, and then they're configured. They're really VMs behind the scene in Azure SSIS, whether you're running in the catalog or you're running from the file system. And so, yes, you've got this new dimension where you can crank up the you can crank up the sliders there. But as you pointed out earlier, Carlos, if you're running in a VM, you could do that too, right? You just take more of the host power if you want. So it's not that new.
Sure.
The other thing, though, that this gives you, and I think this is compelling, is it may be that the particular load you're doing, SSIS isn't the best way to load that data. It may be good, but not as good as something like Databricks or any of the other tools. Like, you want to load Parquet files and stuff like that. Those loaders scream.
Sure.
They're doing a lot of data really, really fast. Now, I'm just not sure because I'm not taking it apart in SSIS and seeing if I could replicate those speeds. I don't know. I just don't know.
Sure.
But the numbers, it's terabytes. You're loading terabytes in a handful of minutes. That's crazy fast.
That is fast.
So
now,
you lift and shift, and then you can say, all right, I'm loading this data from this file type, and I bet you I can do this faster in some other form. Maybe I can do it in a mapping data flow, which has Databricks running under the hood. So you reconfigure it in an ADF pipeline with an ADF mapping data flow, and the next thing you know, instead of it taking an hour to load, it's taking a few minutes. That's the story. That's kind of how they want you to. I think this is my interpretation of their story. I'm not speaking for Microsoft or the team.
Sure.
This is what I see.
So interesting that you say that, and because one of the other things I wanted to talk about was costing, right? So one of the big questions I always get with the cloud is, well, what's it going to cost me? And I'm always like, well, we're going to try it, we're going to run it for a month, and then I'll let you know what it's going to cost.
I don't know of a better way to do that, Carlos. I know some people who claim to be able to tell you how much it's going to cost, and I just tell my customers, my experience is I've never been able to guess right. We'll try it, like you said, try it for a month because they're billing you monthly.
Sure.
And then see at the end of that. But there's some tricks you can do, in especially if you're running, like you're in that scenario where you've just migrated some of your SSIS from on premises into the cloud. So I mentioned earlier when you configure Azure SSIS, which is an integration runtime, and the whole concept of integration runtimes, we could talk about that for a whole show. It's an amazing bit of architecture, in my humble opinion, to where you could just stand up. It's almost like if you had back in the early days, when SSIS first came out, you could actually execute DTS inside of SSIS, and it was similar to that, right? You could just reach into this whole other architecture and run in that. Well, these integration runtimes are like that, except they've kind of built them in, so they haven't done much with it other than, as far as I know, other than SSIS. But imagine that being able to point to a brand new, basically another architecture and run there. So that, to me, really lifts ADF to this huge, this big umbrella orchestration solution where you can do that. But the integration runtimes, the Azure SSIS integration runtimes, you choose the number of nodes and then the size of each node. And those are VMs running in the background.
Right.
So serverless means there's a server you can't get to. It's there.
Sure.
And I think that's true everywhere there's serverless. I can't imagine there not being some kind of virtual or what have you. And that's what these are. These are virtual machines in the back. Whenever a VM is running, you're paying. So if you've got that integration runtime turned on, and you can turn it off, but every time you turn it on, it rebuilds these nodes. It builds one really quickly. As of today, it'll build one in 3 to 5 minutes. And then it'll start another one kind of slowly in the background, which is a huge improvement. It used to take 20 to 30 minutes for each one. Now you get one in about 3 to 5 minutes, and then about 20, 30 minutes later, the other one starts if you've got two, and they'll just continue to start that way. But if you leave that integration runtime running and you're not executing any SSIS packages, and you can, and the way you do execute SSIS packages, one way is you do that from ADF. Again, it's kind of the master orchestrator, and you have an execute SSIS package activity. But once the package is completed, if you just leave it running, you're paying for that. So there's some really interesting patterns out there where the first thing you do is use the REST API, and you turn the integration runtime on. And then
5 minutes before you need the thing to run. Yeah.
right. And as soon as it starts, then you run your SSIS package, and then you turn it off. And this is where kind of the mix and match happens. Is it okay to mention a book I wrote?
Of course.
So in October, Kent Bradshaw and I put out a book on SQL automation through frameworks. And I showed a couple of examples of that. Well, and these are free. You can just go out and get them, these frameworks. And one of them is built to execute in ADF, and it does exactly this. So what's nice about having a framework versus versus running every package like that is a framework wraps up all of these executions into a single call. So you start the IR, you start what we call a framework application, a collection of packages, and then you stop the IR. But it doesn't stop until it's run 300 or 300 SSIS packages up there, whatever it's done. But it's only running when you have it configured. And there's a lot you can do in there in the middle of that with some of the more complex solutions that we've automated. There's a lot you can do with that REST API and just Azure in general. You can automate,
right,
for instance, the moving of the sliders. So maybe and this is an example I give.
Here we go.
I say you can spend $100 and load your data warehouse, or you can spend $100 and load your data warehouse. Now, if you heard the same thing twice, you got it. Yeah, it wasn't a trick. But the dimension that we can now move in with the sliders is how long did it take that data warehouse to load? So it could have been, I'm running, way small, VMs, and I've got everything, and it takes 24 hours to load my data warehouse. I only pay $100. But if I move the sliders, maybe I can do that in 3 minutes. Totally contrived examples here in times.
Sure.
But the principle holds. And some businesses are a race. Some of them, it's competition. I did work for a huge business years ago, and they were the only fish in the pond. It was taking them 3 days to do their data integration, and then another fish showed up, and they were beating them. They were doing it by about a day and a half. And I mean, this was one of those binary. It was either zero figures, well, one figure, or it was 8. Right. That was where they were going to come out at the end of the year, and they were now losing the race.
Wow.
And able to help them with their processing and a few other things. Worked with a fantastic team, and at the end of the day, we ended up knocking down about 3 days down to a couple of hours.
Wow.
And now they were winning the race again, and
sure,
they ran. So it could be it could be that what could your business do with 23 hours and 57 extra minutes of innovation time once the data is loaded? What
right
analysis? So it's some of that's in there. And again, you can automate the sliders, and in a few instances that's what we've been able to do. Say we need to get all of this there first, and then in our processing, then we need to do a massive parallel set of execution. So you can actually, in the process, automate the moving of the sliders, boost everything up, and then shrink it back down and run the rest of the process. So it's, like I said, when you have an orchestration engine like ADF, and the REST API, I think is amazing. I keep learning new stuff about it. I think they keep adding new stuff.
Right.
And it's just amazing what you can do with those sorts of patterns. And the last thing I'll say about it, I've been talking way too much, is when I train people, and I deliver training on ADF and SSIS and catalogs and all of this, and it's all kind of mix and match these days. There's a lot of overlap. I remind people of that scene in The Matrix where there's the kid holding the spoon, and he tells Neo, he says, "There is no spoon." You remember?
I don't remember that scene all of a sudden.
You have to go watch The Matrix again. They're at the Oracle's apartment, and he's there's this. And anyway, he does that, and I used to tell people think outside the box, but Azure has kind of taken us out of the box. It's like there is no box.
Sure.
So you can move all of these levers. It's like you're in flatland and all of a sudden there's something elevated 45 degrees. You know, there's things you couldn't do before that you can do now.
Right.
And it's getting easier and easier to do those things.
So that is, I don't know if mindset is the right, right way to approach that. But yeah, like you mentioned, I think you give some great examples there in terms of costing. It's like, okay, well, there are 100 ways to skin this cat, right? Mm-hmm. What do we want to do? Let's kind of replicate what we have, and then kind of go from there, get that to work, and then we can move the knobs and and play around with it a little bit.
That's it. Yeah, start with what you have, and then think about where you can go from there. And don't lock yourself into, to any kind of thinking about it. Try and think outside the box. And eventually, I think everyone realizes there is no box.
Right.
We can do it a bunch of different ways now.
Yeah, and which is super nice, but also super frustrating as well, right? Like,
well, the flip side of flexibility is complexity. So you can't have flexibility without the complexity that goes along with it. And I think Azure has done an outstanding job of instrumentation, especially here recently. Azure monitors continue to grow. And like you mentioned earlier, you're looking at hitting limits, throttling on the target maybe of trying to load too much data into your instance. And those throttles are there, and they're just like everything else. You can move them, just by paying some more money.
Right.
And you've run into this, Carlos. I can tell by how you've talked about it. Eugene, I bet you've encountered this as well. I certainly have. On initial, kind of the initial shift to Azure, and we've had it with customers going to AWS as well, that the cost is kind of a shock. It's not all, but some. And I would say more than half. They look at this and go, well, this is supposed to be saving me money. That's what the salesperson said.
Right.
And the truth is that the businesses aren't always calculating accurately the cost of running this on premise.
Sure.
So, looking at on-premises costs of things like the amount of time and effort it takes to maintain the OSs on the servers. I don't know of anybody who's measuring that. They're treating it as a sunk cost or just a cost of doing business or something else. It's falling into a bucket somewhere, and nobody's calculating it really. The worst. Well, I say worse. It's not abnormal to see people just look at IT as an expense.
Right.
And I totally
it's changing, but it's still there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you want to share with those folks, look, if you're going to compare this like you're comparing apples to apples, you have to start your accounting differently.
Right.
You have to start doing that differently right now and measuring how much time. You got Eugene out there working on Power BI updates or stuff like that. He didn't have to do that if we're running Power BI in the cloud. They're doing it.
Sure.
Maybe you have to flip a version drop down from 4 to 5 or something. I don't know, but it's not anything like what he's doing there, where he has to install it on a test server, run the old reports through it over and over again. They're doing a lot of that work for you. Now, granted, you should do that kind of work, when you're in the cloud as well, but there's a number of things you don't have to worry about. Updating Defender. I have to do this on my VMs running here locally all the time, every day.
Right. Wants to install something.
What's it costing you? How much is that? What does it cost? What's 5 minutes of your production DBA's time?
Yeah.
Are you counting that because they're spending that, every day or so, just making sure that things keep running, and they should be testing those updates in QA or something that looks exactly like production but isn't.
Right.
And user acceptance testing, what have you. So when they look at, they look at this brand new bill, that's kind of how it looks. I got this extra cost here. It's $7,000 a month or something. That's not saving me any money. I'm hearing that, and I'm like, it's not probably while you're running in parallel. But as you begin to shift that load more and more to the cloud, as you depend on that and shut down your on-premises stuff, and it's not so much okay, I can save $7,000 a month, and I don't need Eugene or Carlos or Andy to stick around and do this anymore. That's not right. What it's more like is now I can use Eugene and Carlos and Andy to innovate, and they can be
what are the business problems that we have to solve?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And see, we know, and Buck Woody has been preaching this for at least a decade, but he says, don't define yourself as a database person. Define yourself as a data person. And you know the organization's data, you know the enterprise's data. So you're going to be in the best position to help with innovation, to help with any kind of migration issues, to help when new data shows up. How do you get that, from a data integration, a data engineering standpoint, how do you get that into the cloud? And it's, there's opportunities to scale and grow that. Could you do it on premises? Actually, yeah, sure. Well, I did it decades ago.
Sure.
I'd leave the office at noon on Friday, drive down to the computer store over there, and it's over by Channel 6 in Richmond.
Right.
And you know where I'm talking about, Carl. Get a box of parts, right? Come back, and on Saturday morning start putting them together, and by Saturday afternoon, if everything goes well, I'm loading the OS, and then Sunday I'm loading the servers and I'm scaling. I'm moving the sliders, and if everything goes really, really well, I've scaled on Monday morning.
Sure.
I'm in great shape.
Yeah, it goes really, really well.
This is a minute or less. Now,
sure.
What can you do with that extra time?
Right. Right.
Anyway, I'm preaching to the choir, I know that. But hopefully somebody's watching and going, maybe he's gone to something there. That fellow with the funny beard.
Well, Andy, we always do appreciate it. We appreciate the conversation. Before we let you go, however, I feel like should we do SQL Family?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Now, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
Oh, gosh. So I was doing manufacturing automation. I was working with programmable logic controllers. I was actually designing and building manufacturing control systems. And there was these human machine interfaces. There was one called Wonderware. They're still around. Wonderware, HMIs, and Rockwell Automation. They had one as well. And RSView. I was trying to remember the name. It's been that long. And they could collect tags, which were data points, and you set the frequency of the tag collection, put it into a database. So I was loading one into Access 95, 97, something like that. It's back when the years began with a 1. And I turned all of the tags on. There was over 1,000 of them. Whoa. And I said, give me a data point every second. Left for a 3-day weekend, came back on Tuesday morning and went to open. It was like a 4 gigabyte access file. Went to open it, it wouldn't open.
No.
So I'm telling on myself now, but I went back then. We used to have these things called computer shows. There was one at the show place in Mechanicsville, just outside of Richmond. I went by there, bought an NFR copy of SQL Server 6.5. So for $20. I shouldn't be saying this. Microsoft's going to come after me for the license. But I just wanted to see if it would do anything different.
Can it handle it, right?
Before that, I went to altavista.digital.com and I searched for Microsoft database, and it said SQL Server. And I was like, what's SQL Server? Anyway, I'm wandering around the show place. I see this, I buy it. It's only $20. Run back down to my manufacturing client, install it, and do the same test. And this works. And not only does it open, it's opening, I think it was Query Analyzer in 6.5. I know Query Analyzer was before SSMS, but I don't know if it was what we had back then or not. But I could run queries. I could see the data. It was still that amount of data, like 4 gigs of data. But
wow, you could look at it, right?
Yeah. So I go to the plant engineer and I say, hey, you need to buy this. Buy a license for this, And 7.0 had just come out. They bought a license for SQL Server 7.0, and that's how I started working with it. Crashing access. That's the short version.
There you go.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours?
Oh, wow. I'd say first be smarter than I was about it. That's my first piece of advice. A mutual friend of all of us here is a guy named Kevin Hazard, who is the architect of architects at a large endeavor in Richmond. And Kevin describes his career as a wing walker, where he walks down the wing of an aircraft, and when he gets to the end of it, another aircraft flies up and matches the wings touch, and he just keeps walking. That's a pretty good description of how things have gone for me as well. I recently wrote about, like, if you wanted to get into data integration and data engineering right now in the Microsoft stack, I would say put about 70% towards cloud integration and about 30% on premises, simply because I believe there's still more people running on premises right now than there are people in the cloud. My customer base is any indication, there's a lot more running on premises still.
Yeah,
and
we're the same way.
And everybody in the cloud is hybrid, so they're still doing both.
Right.
And there's enough resources out there for you to learn skill up on something like SSIS in a relatively short amount of time. I know there's a lot of people out there doing training. There's websites that do training, famous websites that do it. I do it. And so, skill up on that so that you know that. And that's going to help you understand the concepts that you're going to need. But I would actually put more time on cloud, ADF and Azure Synapse Analytics. And they're kind of going through rebranding stuff right now. Microsoft does that. I don't understand marketing, how all of that works and how it helps. I'm sure it does. And just because I don't understand it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. But there's a lot of overlap still between ADF and Azure Synapse Analytics. So whatever you learn in ADF, a lot of it is going to still apply.
Transfer.
And it's going to be that way, I think, for a while yet. How long? I don't know. But understand the concepts, understand where those overlaps are, and recognize right now everywhere you look, especially on sites like LinkedIn, when they talk about data science, which has been the new shiny for, I don't know, past 3-4 years at least, that the new need is data engineers. And that is exactly what SSIS does. And if you can, there's a lot of terms we can throw out here in acronyms, ETL, ELT, kind of complementary to that, data integration, data engineering, ADF, Azure Synapse, all of these things are talking about data engineering. And it is still a large part of the gig. In order to get data science, Frank and I have a podcast. If you want to throw it in the show notes, you can, but we interviewed someone not long ago. And he was joking about data engineering. And he says, what we say in data science is, well, first you get the data. And if you do this kind of work, that's somewhere between 50 and 90% of the work actually in the project. So when you say, first you get the data, and then you start, talking about Power BI, like Eugene's a genius at Power BI, by the way. If you don't know that, now you do. And, and then you start talking about R and all of these other, engines out there that people are using, Polybase and what have you. Now you can do the beautiful graphics and the insightful charts and all of that stuff. But first you have to get the data.
Sure.
And there's a huge need for data engineers right now. According to the experts, this isn't me. This is what, what everybody is saying. And almost everyone I know that does this kind of work right now is busy. So, that there's just a lot. Not everybody, but almost everybody I know is busy.
Sure.
So just keep that in mind. And I would say the other piece of advice I give anybody going into technology, two really short blips. One is, if you want to learn something and do that same thing for the rest of your career, this is really not that kind of field.
Right.
It just isn't.
You're in the wrong field. Yeah.
Right. And I'm not trying to be mean about it. I mean, you could do, so if you reach architect level, and I consider all three of us architects, if you reach that level, there's concepts that you get, and then it becomes a matter of switching, understanding how syntax works and what performs better here and there and that sort of stuff. But even then, you're still having to go learn that syntax. And I would say be prepared. My level set with junior engineers and new people is be prepared to spend a quarter of your time, 25% of your time learning. And they're saying, well, Andy, I'm working 40 hours a week. Totally wasted 20 hours, or 10 hours on the weekend, right?
Right.
Not trying to be mean. That was mean. But really, I mean, I do it. I'm a morning person, and I wake up early because I grew up on a farm. I usually do my learning in the morning. That's when my mind's at its best, and I get my head around it. But I'll do a couple, 3 hours, every morning, just reading through what's new, going out there and playing with some of the new stuff that's available. You have to do that. You have to keep up. That's one thing. And I think actually that was both of them. Don't count on doing one thing for the rest of your career. And the way you solve it is continuous learning.
Very good. Now, what's one thing that can instantly make your day better?
Oh, my day better. Gosh, I love helping somebody. And most of the time I do it, it's free. Somebody writes me they think it's the end of the world. There is no way to do this thing with SSIS or ADF. How do you do it?
Yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah. And it's like something I did yesterday. And so I'll write it up real quick and send them. I can't believe it. That's so awesome. And those are, the feedback is nice. Don't get me wrong. It warms my heart, but it's it's just the help. And it's because I love learning, and I've always loved learning. And it's like the coolest thing to learn something. And now I'm giving that to somebody else.
Sure.
It's like, oh, here's the best gift ever. And especially if somebody, is really, really stuck on something. Now, what'll also happen is I'll get these little one-liners. It's, I know this, you can figure this out in 5 minutes. And it's like, the technology to do what you're asking doesn't exist yet. Maybe quantum can do that. Yeah. But they think, it's this dog simple thing to do.
Yeah, go back and ask Ant-Man, right? That's funny. Yeah, to get the two extremes there. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about purchasing stuff, making to make your own computer back in the day. I'm not sure how far $10,000 would get you then, but let's say you have $10,000 in right now. What kind of computer tech are you going to purchase?
Oh, I am so far out of this game. I'm going to send that money to somebody like Glenn Berry. And say, Glenn, what can you do with it? Could you build me something awesome with it? Because he's right on top of that. There's other folks out there who stay on top of it as well. But these days I buy stuff pre-configured. So,
there you go.
When I'm purchasing my own. But $10,000, that's a hefty budget. I mean, there's all sorts of really cool stuff out there. I'm still being a data integration guy, and especially with SSIS, I still love RAM. So sure. I think the new machines, there may be something out there with 256 gigs on it. I know there's some 128s out there. The box I'm using right now it's a few years old, and it has 64. And I love being able to set up a 34 gig VM, and and it's got 4 processors hyper-threaded, so 8 logical, and so I'll give it 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, and it's like. It's like a portable server, virtual. Yeah. It's just crazy. So love that stuff.
That's cool. Now, what famous person in history would you want to spend the day with?
Wow. A couple of names leap to mind. The very first one is Winston Churchill.
Okay.
Yeah. I think he was a
leader.
Before
or after the war?
That's a good question. He took a beating in the war. And I think it was telling. I think it showed some. Probably, he was busy during the war, so probably before,
Gotcha.
I would say. And after he learned a lot about politics, probably stuff he didn't ever want to learn.
Right.
Kind of came with the gig.
Right.
But,
You talk about on the job learning, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Andy, our last question for you today. What's your favorite ice cream topping?
Gosh, I don't eat ice cream much anymore.
Okay, so you have to
I'm
go back
type
and
2 diabetic, but when I still do, I'll confess I do. I'm the worst type 2 diabetic ever. But when I do, I'm very simple. I like McDonald's hot fudge sundaes. So hot fudge.
There you go.
I'm a chocoholic. Way back.
You can't go wrong there.
That's my favorite. That's a good question. I like that.
Okay, so let's see. Thanks, Andy, for being on the. I'm sorry, I was skipping ahead in my mind. I went to autopilot there for a second. You'll forgive me, Andy. So thanks for being on the program today with us. We appreciated the conversation, and compañeros, thanks for tuning in. So if folks want to reach out to you, you mentioned some of the training that you provide, right? Your books.
Sure.
How can people engage with you, Andy?
So andyleonard.blog is probably a good fair site. I'll blog about the books. I'll blog about the training and things there. It's wildly popular compared to the other sites that I work with and manage. So that's a good place to go. andyleonard.blog.
There we go.
Yeah.
Eugene?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SQLGene, and I blog at SQLGene.com.
There we go. I thought maybe your mute button just gotten stuck this episode.
Yeah, well, there were a couple times that I forgot that I had it on. Yeah. It's all right. I didn't have anything important to say.
And compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am Carlos El Chacon. Again, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.